Hello, today I will be showing you how to use the Unity animation system to switch between animations on a player. This is just an example, and I'm going to show a very simple and basic way to do this. If you are more advanced with Unity, you will not want to do things this way because there are some problems with it. But if you're a beginner, this is good enough for an early game while you're practicing and learning. So what we're going to do today is we are going to open, first of all, the window that we'll be using. So right now, we're assuming that you already have your animation created, your animations created, because the whole point of this tutorial is how to switch between them. So if you haven't yet created your animations, you will need to go and do that before we start. So I have here a character with a move up, left, right, and down animation all separately, and an idle animation. So I'll be showing you how to use that. If you have something slightly different, you should still be able to follow along, and I'll be explaining kind of where you can do things differently as we go. Okay, so for my example here, the first thing I need to do is get my Animator window open. So the Animator, and I say that a little bit oddly just to make it clear that it's different from animation. So animation and Animator. The Animator is for controlling which animation is playing at any given point in time. So you'll only have one Animator for each game object, but you will have potentially multiple animations. So to open your Animator, you go up to Window at the top of the screen, and you choose Animation, and you choose Animator. And that will open an Animator window. Mine opened there. Yours will probably be a separate window when it opens. Mine's not wanting to jump out. There we go. It'll probably be a separate window like this when it opens. Now, you need a bit of space for your Animator window. It's a little bit annoying. You have to find a place to put it. So I'm going to put mine here docked with a game because I don't really need to see the game while I'm working on the Animator. I simply need to be able to see the character. So then I'm going to click on my player. So in the last tutorial, I set up multiple animations on this player. So my player already had an Animator created. When you create your first animation on a game object, an Animator controller is automatically created as well. And it's already assigned to the game object, and it gets put in the same folder where you put your first animation for that game object. So I put my animations all in this animations folder, and I've got my player game object there. Okay, so I have everything already created in that way. So my player has that animator and it's here. And whenever you have an animator on a player and you add a new animation to that object, your Animator will get that animation added to it automatically. Now you can add more animations manually to an animator that already exists. You can remove animations, etc. But I already have these added automatically. Now, this is a happy coincidence. I happen to add, to duplicate this animator and add another animation afterwards. So I can actually show you how to add an animation if for some reason one of your animations aren't on the list. So you can just right click anywhere on your animator to open a context menu, and you can click on Create State and Create Empty to add a new state to your animator. Now this won't have any animation associated with it. So with that state selected, I'm going to go over to my inspector over on the right hand side, and I'm going to see where it says None Motion. I'm going to go ahead and click on the circle next to that, and that is going to bring up another window where you can choose what animation you want to put there. And mine is the idle animation because it's not on my animator yet. Now, if you followed the tutorial last time, all of your animations should already be on your animator, so you should not have to do this step. But if you did for some reason, that's how you do it. Now, I do want to change that from being called New State to being called Idle, so it's clear what that animation is. Okay, now one of these animations is orange. And that's because you can see there's an arrow going from entry into the orange one. And the orange one is the default animation. And it's the animation that will be played first and only unless you add some changes to this animator. So right now, my player is going to start off walking down. And they'll just walk down forever. Now, usually when you start a game, your player is not walking by default. They should just be standing there by default. So I'm going to right click my idle animation and I'm going to set this as the layer default. And now you can see entry is now pointing, has an arrow pointing to the idle, and it is now orange. You also may see this any state blue one over here. Leave that alone for now. And entry, this just indicates where the start of your animation will be. So the actual animations in your animator are the gray boxes and this orange box. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is arrange these in a way that is a little bit more easy to see. So I'm going to put walk up at the top, walk left on the left, walk right on the right, and walk down on the bottom to make everything a little bit easier. Now, if you're wondering how I'm moving around here, I'm middle clicking, and that allows you to move this. It's a little bit annoying. That's the way you have to do it. I don't know if there's another way. Middle click will let you move this around. Okay, so now I have my animations arranged in a way that is a bit easier to use. However, in order to actually change between animations, we have to add something called a transition. Because right now, we would just sit in our idle animation and you can see there's no connections to any of the other animations, so you would never change to one of the other animations. So in order to change between animations, you need a connection, and those are called transitions. So let's start with our player moving to the right. So if I right click on the idle animation, I can choose make transition, and that will create a transition from the thing I right clicked on to whatever I then click on. So I'm going to click on walk right, and this will make a transition. You can see there's an arrow pointing in the direction of the transition. It'll go from idle to walk right. Now, right now, by default, this transition will happen whenever the idle animation finishes. It will then immediately go into the walk right transition. And think to yourself for a minute, what will happen after that? Will you ever go into another transition? And if so, which clip will you go into? The answer is none. You will never change because there's no arrows leaving walk right. So you would never leave the walk right animation. You would be there forever, which is not ideal either. So we can put an arrow going from the walk right and make a transition to back to idle. So what would happen right now is that when idle finishes, it will immediately go to walk right, and when walk right finishes, it will immediately go back to idle. Now this is not ideal because it will cause our player to constantly turn right, walk 2 steps, and then turn back towards us. Turn right, walk 2 steps, turn back towards us. Not what we want. So how do we change this? What we're going to do is set up these things called parameters. And parameters are values that are set via a script. And our Animator Controller will choose what to do based on these parameters. So for this example, I'm going to create a parameter for our speed in the horizontal direction, left and right, and our speed in the vertical direction, up and down. So to do that, on my animator here, I'm going to go to the Parameters tab, and I'm going to click on plus, and I'm going to click on float. So that will create a new float style parameter. And I'm going to call the first one speed H, and I'm going to add another float style parameter and call it speed V. Remember that float in programming means a number with a decimal point in it. So I've created 2 parameters, speed H and speed V. Now, I must make this very clear and give you a very clear warning. The capitalization and the spelling and the names on these parameters is very important. Later in your code, you will change these parameters and you must spell them exactly the same way that you spelled them in this list. If there is any difference, it will not work. Your code will not work. You'll get a warning and nothing will happen. No change will happen to your animation. So it's really important to keep a consistent naming convention when you're naming your parameters so that you remember how you've named them before. All right, or always just go check if you're not sure. Okay, so I have a speed H and a speed V. So on my idle, the transition between my idle and my walk right, I want that to happen under a certain condition. So I want you to think for yourself, stop and think for yourself for a moment, based on our speed H and our speed V numbers. So speed H is your horizontal speed in the X direction. Speed V is your vertical speed in the Y direction. And they can be negative and positive. So if speed H is negative, it means you're going to the left. If speed H is positive, it means you're going to the right. And the same thing for V. Negative is down and positive is up. So think about that for a minute and think about what is the condition that would cause you to go to the right. And I want you to think on your own for a moment. Right, so the condition is if my speed horizontal, so my speed H is greater than 0, it means I'm going to the right. Now I'm going to cut us a little bit of heartache and headache and pain here and say that instead of using 0, we're actually going to use 0.1. And that's because of how the float checking works in Unity. And it's for when we come back, actually. But for now, we'll say, okay, well, if you're going really slowly, we're not going to worry that you have, you've started walking, because you would barely be able to tell. So only if it's greater than 0.1 will we start showing the move right animation. So how do we actually do that? Well, we need to click, first of all, as I have here, on our move, our transition from idle to walk right. So select on that, and you can see that mine is slightly blue. Then you're going to go over here to the inspector. And down at the bottom, you'll see conditions. So we need to change that because the list is empty right now. So there's no conditions specifying whether we should move to the right or not. So to add a condition, we're going to click on the plus button and it will add a condition. And it will choose the top parameter on our list, which in this case is speed H, and that is in fact the parameter we want. So change the greater in that slot. Well, we still want it to be greater, don't we? Because we want it to be greater than 0 or 0.1 in our case. So we're going to leave that as greater. But then instead of 0, we're going to put 0.1. So if our speed is greater than 0.1, then we should transition, to the speed, to the walk right animation. Now, that's great, but it's not actually enough. We do have one more thing that we need to do, and that is to change our settings for the transition up here. So we have, first of all, we have has exit time ticked. What that means is that after our animation will only transition after a certain point in time, after the idle animation is finished. We don't want that. We want it to transition immediately. So for some animations, you may want it to wait until the animation finishes playing before we change to the other animation. This is not one of those cases. So we're going to untick has exit time. Then the last thing we need to change is this transition duration. Right now it is at 0.25. That means that our transition will last 0.25 seconds. We do not want that. We want our transition to be instant. A transition time is useful for either puppet style, mesh deformation, or 3D animation. But right now I'm dealing with a sprite animation. So if you're dealing with something else, 3D animations, puppet style animations where things are moving around, you may wish to have a transition duration so your animation looks smooth. It will smoothly change to the other animation. But in our case, we do not want that. We want our sprite to change instantly to the new animation. So we need to change this transition duration to 0. Okay, that's one transition. We now need to do the one going back from walk right. So I'm going to do that one now. So for this one, we want to again add a condition, first of all, at the bottom. So click the plus sign to add a condition to our other transition. Make sure you've selected the correct transition, the one going back from walk right to idle. And we're going to change that to be less than 0.1. So speed horizontal, when it is less than 0.1, we're going to stop walking right and go back to idle. So less than 0.1. And again, we need to change our settings here. So we need to untick has exit time, and we need to change our transition duration to 0. And that will set up our transition. Okay, so we've now set up one of our 4 different transitions. We need to do the other 4. I want you to have a go now at trying that yourself. So please pause the video, go ahead and try yourself adding your other 3 transitions. And remember to change to be using vertical, and remember to change to use negative numbers. So when you're going left and down, you should be using negative numbers, and you'll have to flip the less than and greater than. And when you're going up and down, you'll need to use the vertical speed instead of the horizontal one. So go ahead and have a go at that on your own. Pause the video, try it out, and when you come back, I'll have mine set up, and I'll show you them briefly, and then we'll move on. Okay, hopefully you tried that on your own. What I've got now is my Animator is all set up here. So I've got from idle to walk up, I have a transition with speed vertical greater than 0.1. And for going back from walk up, back to idle, I have speed vertical less than 0.1. For my walk left, I have speed horizontal less than negative 0.1. And I have, for my walk left going back to idle, speed horizontal greater than negative 0.1. For my walk down, I have my speed vertical less than negative 0.1. And for my walk down going back to idle, I have my speed vertical greater than negative 0.1. So double check that you've got all your less thans or greater thans correct, you've got your negative and positives correct, and you've got your horizontal and verticals correct. Also make sure on all of your transitions you have has exit time unticked, and you have your transition duration set to 0. With all of that done, we should now be ready to move on to the code portion of this tutorial. So when you have your animation all set up, your Animator all set up, you have these parameters, but if you run the game, those parameters will just stay at 0 forever unless your code changes them. So the Animator on its own does not actually know what your character's speed is. It has to be told that by a script. And once it's told the speed, it can make a decision based on the logic that you've put down in these transitions. It can decide what animation to play, but it has to be told the speed by your script. So we need to make a script that will tell our Animator the speed of the player based on whatever you like, but we're going to use physics in this example. We're going to use the physics system on the player, determine what their speed is, and pass that information to our Animator. Okay, so to do that, you need to have a script on your player. So we can create a brand new one, or what I'm going to show you is you can actually include this in your player's movement script or whatever you like. You can include this on an existing script, or you can create a new one. If you're doing your animation based on maybe inputs instead of on the physics, then you would want to do that in your in your input script. For us, we could do it on a separate script because the physics are kind of independent. We can access them even if we don't know what the player has actually pressed in terms of buttons. But for simplicity's sake, we're going to do it on the same script as our movement. So I'm going to double click my existing player movement script here. And we have this open. So the first thing I'm going to do, I don't actually have on this player movement script an update function, because in my example, my player movement is done using UI buttons. So they just have functions that it calls. It doesn't have an update function. Your player movement script may already have an update function, or whatever script you're already using may have an update function. I'm going to assume for mine it doesn't, and you can add the code from my update function into yours, even if you already have one. What you should not do is, if you already have an update function, you should not add another one, because that will not work. Your code will not compile, it will not run. So you need to have only one update function, and you can combine these two together if you need to. Okay, so to create my update function, I'm going to do public void update. And this is a function called by Unity once per frame automatically. So I'm always making sure to add comments to explain exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to make my, my text a little bit bigger to make sure that you can see. Okay, so called once per frame by Unity. Now the first thing we're going to do is get the rigid body, and experienced programmers will know this isn't the most efficient thing to do because we're getting the rigid body every frame, but for beginners it's a bit easier. So that's why we're doing it this way. If you go to make a full game, you really shouldn't get your rigid body every single frame. You should get it once and hold on to it. But as a beginner, it's okay to do things in a way that is a little bit less efficient in order to learn. So the first thing we're going to do is get our rigid body that we'll need to find the physics information. So we'll create a variable to hold it in. Remember, variables are like containers for data, and they have to be a very specific type. Basically, think of it as a shape and size. The containers type, shape, and size have to match what is inside it. So our variable is going to be a variable that will hold a rigid body 2D. So I'm going to write in rigid body 2D, and that's the type of variable. And I'm going to call this variable our rigid body. This is just a label that you put on a variable in order to use it. So, sorry, squeaky chair. The next thing we need to do with our rigid body is get it. So we'll use the function getComponent, and this is a function that will go to the game object that our script, this script, player movement for my case, this script is attached to. And it will go to that game object, it will check for a particular type of component on that game object. So in this case, we're going to check for a rigid body 2D. And we need our closing, open, close parentheses there to indicate that a function is being called. This is a function that's going to go do something. And then we need a semicolon at the end. So this whole line of code is creating a variable for our rigid body, and then it's storing the rigid body that's attached to this game object into that variable. If your game object does not have a rigid body attached, it will not be able to find anything. There are ways to guarantee there will be a rigid body on this script's game object. We're not going to go over that because this is for beginners. So for now, just know if your script isn't working, make sure that a rigid body is actually attached to your player, or the script will not function. Okay, once we have our rigid body, the next thing we need to do is to actually get the speed in the horizontal and vertical direction from it. So find out from the rigid body what our current horizontal and vertical speeds are. Okay? And we do that by creating new variables to contain that information when we go to get it. So we're going to have float current speed h equals our rigid body dot velocity dot x. So horizontal and x, those are the same. And float current speed v, vertical, is our rigid body dot velocity dot y. So remember, the dots in Unity and C# and the scripting language that Unity uses means go to that thing and get something. So when we assign the horizontal speed, we're saying go to our rigid body and then go to the velocity on the rigid body and get the x coordinate or the x component of that velocity. So the direction or the speed in the horizontal direction, and the same thing for the y. All right, so now we have two variables containing our horizontal and our vertical speeds, and they are all set up. They have the speeds in them. We've got that information from the physics system. Our script has it. So now we just need to pass that information to the animation system. This script is just a big go-between. It's taking information from physics and giving it to animation. So let's, again, as we had to get a component up here for our rigid body, in order to interact with the physics system, we now need to get a component from our animation system in order to interact with it. So get the animator component that we will be using for setting our animation. Okay, and to do that, again, we need a variable, and the thing that's going in this variable will be an animator. So that is the type of the variable, is an animator, and we're going to call it our animator, and we will set it equal, just as we did above, get component animator, and that will go to our game object, get the animator that is attached to our game object, and store it in our variable. Okay. Lastly, we need to pass information to this animator. So tell our animator what the speeds are. And to do that, we say our animator, sorry, not our rigid body, our animator dot set float. This is a function. So we're going to go to, that's what the dot means, go to the animator, and on it, we're going to set a float. And remember, our parameters we created were float type parameters. So that's why we're using set float. If you use a Boolean, an integer, or a trigger type parameter, then you would use a different setting here. And you can use those types of parameters to change maybe how you control your player's movement. If you want to just do something based on whether something is on or off, you would use a Boolean. You could use a trigger to just make something happen once and then not again. So there's a lot of options, but what I've showed you today is floats, and it's the easiest way to do player movement. Okay, so we have our animator set float, and inside these parentheses, we need to give it some information. So the first thing we need to tell it is the name of the animator parameter. So remember, back in Unity, we named these animators specific things, speed H and speed V. The name you type into these quotes in your script must match exactly. Spaces, capitalization, spelling, everything. So it's really important to double check that it is correct, or your script will not work. Okay, so we've got our animator dot set float, and we're going to type in here speed H. And then inside these parentheses, we need a comma to indicate that there is a second parameter to this function. So we've got speed H, and we have a second parameter, and that is what we're actually setting the speed to. And we have stored that information up above in current speed H. That's a variable we've stored that information in. So we're going to type in here current speed H. And then you need a semicolon at the very end of that line. So this whole line of code says, go to our animator, set on that animator a float parameter. The parameter's name is speed H, and the value that we're setting it to is what is contained in our variable current speed H, which we set up above from a physics system. And now we're going to do the exact same thing, but with speed V and current speed V. Okay, we are almost done. Save your script, go back to Unity, make sure that your script is attached to your player's game object, and go ahead and try it out. What we hopefully will see is that your player will now run their animation depending on the direction that they're moving in. So you can see mine working there. Now there is a couple things we could do to make this a little bit nicer. First of all, my character is walking a little bit fast, or he's walking at one speed even when he's not actually moving all one speed. So you can actually very easily make your animation speed scale based on the value of the parameters you've set. Right? So if you click on Animator, and this is optional, but it can make your character look a little bit better. And if you click on, let's say, walk right here, and you look in your inspector, you'll see that there is a value for speed. If you have walk right selected, there's a value for speed, and there's a multiplier, can't speak, that you can then set. And if we click on parameter there, we can choose what parameter to use as the multiplier for the speed of our character. Now, I'll warn you right away that if you do this, your character will start moving really fast. They'll look really funny. So you're going to want to reduce your overall speed a bit since you're using this multiplier to add to that speed. So let's go ahead and change our overall speed to be about 0.3. I found that to look nicer on mine. You may change it to be whatever you like. So I'm just going to change that for the right movement for now, not for up and down or left, just so we can test it out. So if I now press play, you can see if I press right, our player moves a little bit slower when he's actually going slower, and he moves faster when he's going faster. And I think that overall, that speed looks good. So I'm going to do the same thing to my up, down, and left. All right, so if I click on up over here, and I then click over here to the speed, I'm going to change the speed to 0.3. I'll add a parameter, and instead of speed H for up, I'm going to change it to speed V. For walk left, again, I'll change the speed to 0.3, add a parameter, and leave it at speed H. And for walk down, I'll change the speed to 0.3, add a parameter, and change it to speed V. So now, if I try my game, I should see a nice sort of speed up and slow down in all the directions, and it looks a little bit more natural. Now, there's a lot of things that could be improved in this animation. First of all, what you may notice, every time you stop, you go back to looking downwards instead of having sort of a different idle depending on which direction you're facing. That's something you could add to your animator. You wouldn't actually have to change the code at all. All you would have to change is your animator with all the transitions so that you had separate idle states for up, down, left, and right. It would get a lot more complicated, however. The other thing that you can do is you can, right now, if you're pressing up and then you suddenly press right, it takes a while for your character to start moving to the right. So there's a lot of ways you could approach fixing this. The easiest way would be to add what's called a blend tree, a blend state in the animation, in the animator, and you wouldn't have to change your code at all. However, it's more complicated than what we're going to cover in this tutorial, but it's something you could look into on your own if you want. So hopefully this has given you an introduction to how Unity's animation system works. It is definitely a very basic tutorial. If you want more information, I suggest looking on Unity Learn and looking at the Unity documentations. There are plenty of examples out there. Hopefully this was useful to you. If you have questions, feel free to ask in the comment section below, and look forward to future tutorials. Thanks, bye.